Hello, and you're most welcome to the RCSI MyHealth lecture series. My name is Professor Steve Kerrigan, and today we are going to discuss vaccinations in the time of COVID-19. In the last 12 months, the unprecedented and ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has caused a severe shock to the entire global population. Almost overnight, everything changed in terms of how we work, how we learn, and how we interact with each other. It would be hard to overestimate the trauma COVID-19 has inflicted on us all, both personally and professionally. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, with the arrival of several new vaccines, all of which have shown great promise in the fight against COVID-19. Today, I am joined by Dr. Fidelma Fitzpatrick, Senior Lecturer and Consultant Microbiologist at RCSI and Beaumont Hospital, Dublin. I'm also joined by Professor Jonathan Hourihan, Head of Department of Pediatrics, RCSI, and Consultant Pediatrician at Temple Street Children's Hospital to discuss the topic in more detail. I would just like to advise our viewers that this session was recorded on the 16th of February, and information shared by our panelists is relevant and accurate at the time of recording. Fidelma, I might come to you first. The arrival of the first COVID-19 vaccines is a major development in the coronavirus pandemic. However, some people are asking if the COVID-19 vaccine is safe. Maybe you might start by explaining what a vaccine is and what it might be used for.
So in a way, I often think of vaccines as a medication that's designed to prevent infection. So we're all used to medications to treat infections like antibiotics, but a vaccine gets one step ahead and tries to prevent you getting sick from the infection in the first place. So the way it does it is it prepares or it primes your immune system so that if your body comes across a germ that causes an infection, it's ready to produce antibodies, there's no delay, and you're going to be protected. So to me, the best example of the success of vaccination in Ireland is the polio vaccine. So polio was a disaster in Ireland in the 1940s and 1950s. And I know from talking to my dad that a lot of his friends and colleagues suffered a lot. They had paralysis, they couldn't work, some of them couldn't breathe properly. So it was hugely contagious viral infection. And in 1957, the polio vaccine was brought in Ireland. And if you look at the HPSC website, there's this amazing graph which starts with lots of polio in Ireland, vaccine, very little, no polio in Ireland. So in 1984 was the last case of polio we had in Ireland. And we've had none since. And even before then, the cases were from people that had travelled abroad and brought it back. So I always think of a vaccine as a bit like a medication that you get as an injection, and it's there to protect you against infection.
We're all hearing about these new improved types of vaccine. Can you explain what these vaccines are and how they might differ from the previous ones we might have got when we were younger?
The first thing to say is vaccines are very specific to the germ that causes an infection. So you have different types of vaccines because you have to have a specific vaccine for a specific infection. But within that, the previous ones are the older ones, like the pneumonia or the pneumococcal vaccine contained a bit of the bacteria, the pneumococcal bacteria, a protein. And once you were injected with that, your immune system started producing antibodies and specific immune cells called memory cells. And that meant that if you ever encountered that pneumonia bug again, you'd be well able to fight it because you produce antibodies. The flu vaccine is a different type. It doesn't contain a bit of protein, but it contains a killed version of the flu virus. So it can't cause you any harm, but it looks like the flu virus. So your immune system reacts to it as if it's a flu virus and produces antibodies and memory cells. And guess what happens if you come across the flu virus? Your immune system produces antibodies and protects you. So for COVID, there's those types of vaccines, the bits of protein, the dead virus are being investigated. But the ones that are really in the news are the RNA vaccines. And they're the new kid on the block, per se. So what is the RNA vaccine? So an RNA is a bit like, it's a code. So it's a code for your body to produce something. So with COVID, the important bit for your immune system to recognize as the outside, the spike protein. So the RNA vaccine has the code to produce the spike protein. So it's really clever. So what happens is you're injected with the RNA or the code. It gets into your cells, but it only stays in your cytoplasm. It doesn't go anywhere near your DNA. And it instructs your cell to produce the spike protein. And a bit like Snapchat, it disappears then. And then the spike protein that's produced stimulates your immune system to produce antibodies. And then guess what happens? You're protected. And it means that if you encounter the COVID virus, that your immune system recognizes it, it's a face it's seen before, produces antibodies, it's had the memory cells, and you're protected against infection.
These vaccines are new, and it sounds like we know very little about them. And the question everybody wants to know right now is, are they safe? Or what do we know about their safety to date?
So they are new. Actually, you know, I'm here in Beaumont, and this time last year, I had read about COVID in China. I had read about COVID in Italy. Did I think what was going to happen? Absolutely not. So this is all new, but what's unprecedented is the entire world has focused on one bug, and there's been so much money poured into developing diagnostics, treatments, and then medications to prevent it. So that's your vaccination. And it's the first time that I've seen so much publicly available data that's been poured over and scrutinized. So for sure, we have some data, but it's early days yet. So what data do we have? So I got the Pfizer vaccine, which is great. And the Pfizer vaccine published their trials in December. And there was about 44,000 people included in the trial. And it showed that the vaccine protected me. It had 95% efficacy against severe infection. And there was remarkably few side effects reported. So the most common ones were things I experienced. So I experienced a sore arm, but if somebody stuck a needle in your arm, you're going to be sore anyway. And I certainly was a bit feverish and achy, but it was nothing too major to talk about. When they looked at serious side effects in the trial, it was very similar between actually the vaccine and the control group. I think it was about 0.5, 0.6%. And they had 4 cases of what they call Bell's palsy, which is a facial paralysis. And when they looked at it, it was what you would expect under normal circumstances. So it was nothing above average. Now, the other RNA vaccine is the Moderna vaccine that's also been brought out in Ireland. And the results of that trial, there was about 30,000 people. It was again 95% effective, and remarkably again very few side effects, the common things that I've already described. And again they had 4 cases of Bell's palsy, but 1 was in the control group, which I suppose underlines the point that this was something that just happened by chance. Now with both of those trials, the follow-up is 2 months, because again it's early days yet. And then the other vaccine that's recently been brought in Ireland is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Now, the big thing is everybody now knows that the big attraction with that is you keep that in the fridge. So for global distribution, it's much more applicable. And there was 2 papers, one in December and one just this month. And it's about 11,000 and 17,000 patients. And the efficacy in that was 70% when they compared everybody. But the more recent paper, what they looked at was if you give somebody a single dose, do you get an effect? And again, it was about 76%. And again, with the Oxford trial, for that amount of people, there was very few side effects. So there was one case of transverse myelitis, which is a paralysis in the vaccine group. And when the FDA reported on it, they felt that it wasn't directly related to the vaccine. There was one case of hemolytic anemia, which was in the control group, and there was one case of somebody with fever. So to me, the bottom line is that for what we know so far, for the thousands of people that have been included in the trials, there's reassuringly been very few adverse side effects, and it's not clear if they're directly related to the vaccine.
Jonathan, I might come to you next. Can somebody get COVID-19 from the vaccine?
With the vaccines that we have available at the moment, Steve, the answer is no. There's RNA, as Fidelma says, which isn't going to develop into a full virus, and the antibody response that the body is making is going to be very reassuring, and there's very robust responses. So there's no live virus in any of the vaccines that are either on the market at the moment or are near market. You know, the Sputnik vaccine, even in Russia, is also an mRNA vaccine, as far as I'm aware. So I think people can be very reassured that they're not going to get COVID from this. They can't really get flu from the flu jab either, but that appears to be a widely held myth. And the symptoms that Fidelma describes in herself are part of the immunization. It's almost reassuring when somebody gets a mild response. It shows that there is an immune response going on. Anaphylaxis is a little bit different, and we're going to discuss that separately. But the safety of the vaccines relating to giving you the disease, that's not an issue with these vaccines.
And is it safe for someone to get the vaccine if they have an underlying medical condition or if they have a weakened immune system?
The short answer is yes, because in fact, it's people with hampered or impaired immunity or chronic illnesses that are paying the highest price for these. So it's strongly in people's favor if they have additional medical conditions that they are vaccinated. Now, obviously, people who are on cancer treatments or complex treatments for rheumatological diseases may have dampened immune responses to the vaccine. But any amount of vaccine and any amount of immune response that somebody has that could protect them has to be worth going for, in my view.
Can a patient with a history of allergic reaction get the vaccine?
It's possible to have allergic reactions to vaccines, but people with anaphylaxis due to foods or inhalants or anything like that are safe. The people who need to avoid particular vaccines but can be offered another one are people who have reacted to a vaccine like that before. Now, these are new vaccines, so that's a dead duck too. We haven't had a round of people who've had anaphylaxis to these vaccines before. And I would say that we've been analysing the data relating to the safety data about anaphylaxis in the allergy community where I am interested. And the rates that are reported of between sort of 7 and 11 cases of anaphylaxis per million, we think there's a little bit of over-enthusiasm in those reports due to sort of early bird warning systems and people wanting to report everything. When we use scoring systems that are more commonly in use in our practice, where we see anaphylaxis all the time, like every day, the rates go down to the rates about between 2 and 3 per million. So that's just about the same as the rate from other vaccines. So we don't think there's a major anaphylaxis signal with these vaccines. And once we all get used to them, we think the rates will probably merge into the soup of what we see for other vaccines. We don't think there's any additional risk from these vaccines.
If somebody already had COVID-19 and recovered, do they still need to get vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine? Or do they need to wait until a certain amount of time after having the virus to get that vaccine?
So I suppose there's two questions there. First of all, if you have COVID, do you have to wait? And second of all, even after you've waited, you need to get it. So the general advice is if you currently have COVID infection, you have to wait until you're no longer, I suppose, deemed infectious and you've recovered. So usually that's at least 14 to 21 days. Should you get it? The general advice is again, yes. And the reason for that is we don't know how long immunity lasts from natural infection. So if you look at all the millions of cases in the world, there have been a small but significant proportion of people that have got COVID again. Generally, it's after 3 months. So the advice is that if you've had COVID, you do need to get it. You wait till you're feeling better and you're recovered, but you get it within 3 months of having your COVID infection. And just to the point about the 21 days, the 21 days is the Pfizer vaccine. The Moderna one is about a month apart, and the Oxford one, they're currently looking at different dosing schedules. So you could give it up to a month or two apart.
Fidelma, how quickly will people be protected after they get the vaccine, or what kind of protection does the vaccine offer?
That's a really great question. But what I described before about the immune system remembering, it does take time for your immune system to kick into action. So if you look at the trials that have been published, in the Pfizer trial that was published around December, they published that 54% there was 54% efficacy after first dose. So why would that happen? Well, maybe somebody was incubating the virus when they were getting the vaccine and they just hadn't symptoms, or else maybe they became exposed before their immune system had time to kick in. The Moderna trial was slightly different. They reported an efficacy of over 90% after first dose. So the most recent data from the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is actually trying to answer that question. So there's a preprint that looks about what is the efficacy of a single dose. And if you remember that the December paper talked about an overall efficacy of 70% on average. But after a single dose, they've reported nearly 80%, I think it was 75, 76% efficacy after one dose for symptomatic infection. So it didn't prevent you getting asymptomatic infection. So the long-winded to short-winded answer to your question is it takes a bit of time, but you are partially protected, but you do need 2 doses to get the full effect.
And Fidelma, when you talk about preprints, what do you actually mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's become so much of my lingo at the moment, thanks to COVID. So usually what happens with journal articles is you write up your article and you submit it to the journal and it goes out to what they call peer reviewers. So people like yourself and Jonathan would look at my article and decide whether it's good enough and send it back into the editor, and then you'd all make a decision as to whether my article will be published. But because everything's coming out so fast with COVID, there's these preprint websites that are producing some very good data. But the big caveat with that is they haven't gone to the likes of yourself and Jonathan to make sure that the data is robust. So when I say preprint, it's stuff that literally is hot off the press with the caveat that the international reviewers haven't signed it off.
Fidelma, will people still have to wear a mask and continue COVID-19 safety precautions if they get the vaccine, or do the vaccines prevent transmission of the virus to others?
So when we're talking about vaccines and when I'm describing the data from the trial, what that data is talking about is how a vaccine protects me. So it protects me. I've got the Pfizer vaccine, so it's 95% effective at protecting me against me getting severe infection. What we don't have the data yet is to say, could I carry the virus? And if I am carrying the virus, could I spread it to somebody else? So at the moment, the advice is that you still continue the precautions, because while you're protected, you may inadvertently cause trouble to somebody else that hasn't been vaccinated. Now, there will come a stage when a lot of the population is vaccinated. So that's what they talk about when they talk about herd immunity. When you have a proportion of the population that is protected, then you can start thinking about, well, now what do we do? But that's a little bit of time off. And also by the time we get to that, we'll probably have more data. So there's a few indications that things might be going good. So there's a preprint that indicates that after the first dose of the vaccine, if you happen to get the virus, so you're PCR positive, your viral load, which is the amount of virus you're carrying, is actually much less if you've had the first dose of vaccine. So while it's not proven, you could understand that logically, if you're carrying less virus and you're asymptomatic, you're probably less chance of giving it to others. The other really hopeful news, it hasn't been published unless I've missed the paper, is from Israel, where they've vaccinated a large proportion of the population. And certainly they've shown nearly 45, 46% drop in cases in people over 60 years. And what's great for somebody that works in a hospital, there's been a 34% reduction in severe disease. So definitely the vaccines are very good at protecting individuals. There's a little bit of an indication it might protect in terms of the viral load you're carrying, but for the moment, the advice is to continue the precautions.
Are children susceptible to the virus, or is vaccinating adults enough?
our daily hospital activity has not been disrupted or overwhelmed like the adult hospitals, and thank God for that. Children don't appear to be as susceptible to this virus, and they're not even getting asymptomatic infection as much as we thought they would. So one of the major reasons for immunizing children with influenza was to stop them giving it to other people, because children are, if you like, the term super spreader has come from the COVID epidemic, but that they were spreading it into other vulnerable groups, particularly their grandparents. And I think this is kind of flipping, is that the children are at risk from each other, and they probably are not at risk of giving it to their grandparents as long as their grandparents have been immunized. The greatest price that children have paid is their disruption of their schooling and their social and their sporting lives. And I think it's going to take several years of getting children back into school before the effects on their social activity are played out. I don't think the burden of on children of the actual disease is too great, and whether we get to vaccinating them or not, I don't know. I think it's coming.
Is it safe for children to go back to school, mixing among themselves, even though they haven't been vaccinated?
Well, I think NFET has said schools are a safe place for children, and the reasons why schools aren't open are now political rather than medical, as far as anybody can see. I don't want to be too controversial about it, but children aren't spreading. It's not racing through schools like it is through nursing homes or through healthcare workers who can't avoid bumping into each other or meeting people with COVID. One child with COVID, it seems that they're almost keeping it to themselves. It's not widely documented that there is large spread from an asymptomatic child before they become symptomatic, giving it to other children in their school. And outbreaks in school around the world have been really quite small. So I think schools should be open like they are in other countries with rates like ours.
Jonathan, why weren't children included in the early studies or trials of the vaccine? And have any potential long-term side effects been identified in children?
Well, children rarely get into the early trials of anything, Steve. And partly that's because companies have not wanted the liability of long-term damage, where somebody who had damage from medical illness might live 50 or 70 years with the condition, and the likely insurance liability is likely to be great. So trials in children are always after the trials in adults. And there are now mandates on companies when they're proposing trials before this pandemic that they have to do pediatric clinical trials if they want to get licensed in children. And I know Pfizer and AstraZeneca have started trials in children, but they're only down to the age of 12 so far. And I think somebody's going to have to take that jump and say, either we're going to accept that we do this like with other vaccines and we just proceed to vaccinating gradually down through the age groups, or somebody's going to have to do the trials down to babies. And I would think it's unlikely to be trials down to babies, because that's never really been done. Are there long-term side effects? Well, I don't think we've any data about long-term side effects in anybody. These products have got licensed at a speed that is unimaginable. Normally it takes 10 years to get drugs to market, and this has taken 10 months. But we've no reason to expect that there will be undue side effects with these vaccines, because we haven't had undue side effects in huge numbers for most vaccines that we've developed.
Fidelma, do we know yet how long the vaccine will last once we get the injection?
So the short answer to that is no, we don't know yet, but that's because the trials have only come out in December, and it's a 2-month follow-up period. But what we know from reinfection is that most people that get a second COVID infection get it after 3 months. And when they look at the immunity, that certainly would bear out. But if you look at the family of coronaviruses, they're very clever viruses, and changing is what they do. So COVID is a coronavirus. So the general opinion would be we all expect it to evolve and change. So when we're seeing all these reports of new variants, that's to be expected. Like if I was a coronavirus, I'd have to adapt to survive. It's just what they do. I suppose the key thing is how much the change is. So if it's a huge change, a bit like the way flu changes or influenza changes, you may have to adjust what's in the vaccine. So I fully expect down the line to be getting regular COVID vaccines along with my flu jab. But as to whether that's every 6 months or every year or every 2 years, we simply don't know yet.
Fidelma, we're all aware of these new variants that are popping up across the world. Will we need to get a new vaccine every time there's a new variant?
So we won't need a new vaccine for every strain, because what I said before is changing their appearance is what coronaviruses do. Actually, it's what most bugs do anyway, because they're natural survivors, otherwise they wouldn't be bugs and survive. I think it's to do with the kind of change. So when we're talking about the COVID vaccines, most of the COVID vaccines, actually all of them, are targeted at this thing called a spike protein. It's kind of a bit like a pump rocker with a Mohican. So it's these spikes are really important for your immunity. So if you change a bit of the way your Mohican looks, it still looks like a Mohican. But if you change dramatically how the Mohican looks, it might look less like a Mohican and something like something different. So if you've got these big, huge changes, your immune system won't recognize it, which means you'd be vulnerable to infection. But definitely that's something that everybody's very, very aware of. And indeed, the AstraZeneca trials, some of them were conducted in South Africa. So they're very closely focusing on South Africa because that's one of the transmissible strains, and seeing, do they need to adapt the constituents of their vaccine to address that new strain?
Jonathan, everybody wants to know, when is this going to go away and when can we have our lives back? What is the metric that we're looking for to know that things are getting better?
These are the big questions, aren't they? You know, we've gone through the lockdowns, we've known people who've been sick, we may know people who have succumbed to this. With the vaccines coming now and the rates at which we're vaccinating people in a way that we've never done in this country, although we're slower than other countries, it's still an incredible speed of delivery. Maybe if we get to the point where we've got 70 or 80% of the population immunized, we will have achieved the herd immunity that was mentioned initially in the British press conferences and was laughed out of court. And as they're going in Sweden, they might get to herd immunity slowly or quicker than we would by having lockdown, but it's going to be slower than we're going to get to herd immunity with immunization. So I think we have to proceed with this immunization program and try and make it as universal and as complete and as safe as we possibly can. And while we're doing that, I think still, like with children and others moving around, you have to presume that you have COVID until you feel you haven't, and you don't know who might be walking past you unimmunized with your unimmunized person beside you. So we still need to practice our social distancing and hand washing and hand hygiene. But it might be the case that we have to live with COVID-19 for a few years. You know, the influenza in 1918 to 1920 eventually went away, and that was without immunization. So I think we can expect that we will get to a life after COVID, but it's not going to be on the 4th of June at 2 o'clock. It's not going to be on the 4th of December at 7:25. I don't know when we're going to get there, but I'm confident we can get there.
As we come to a close in this valuable discussion, Fidelma, what key take-home message do you want to leave with our viewers?
Get informed. There is so much information out there. There's a lot of misinformation, but if you have any concerns, look up some reputable websites. We've put up a few. For example, the HSE and the WHO have really good websites about the COVID vaccines and generally about COVID. The New England Journal of Medicine, while it's written very scientifically, have tons of frequently asked questions so that you can focus in on the question you want to answer. The American ID Society have really nice summaries of the data so far on vaccines. And then our own Royal College of Physicians in Ireland, there's frequently asked questions if you're worried about allergies and adverse effects, and also for pregnant women. So I would say get informed, look something up that's reputable, and go get the vaccine. I'd absolutely no hesitation getting it myself, but hands up, I've seen the devastation in the hospital. to people, to their relatives, and I've also seen the devastation in terms of the economy to friends of mine who no longer are working.
And what about you, Jonathan?
We've lived through the most rapid development of any medical innovation in the last year in response to what is almost an existential threat to society. So get with the program, get vaccinated. But that's the message for going forward. And what I'd like to say is to congratulate people for what they've done so far, because social distancing and isolation has dealt Ireland a good hand with this vaccine. The way we live in Ireland and the way we've responded to the NFET and governmental agendas that have been put in front of us, we've been tolerant of confusion. We've done what we've been asked to do largely. And I think we wouldn't have got here if people hadn't trusted the advice that they were being given and done what they needed to do. Children out of school, people closing their workplaces, grannies not seeing their grandchildren. This was unthinkable a year ago. We've done that hard work. And the analogy we used in Temple Street after the first lockdown was, this was only half time. And we were ahead at half time because we hadn't had a bad first half, but we knew that the coronavirus would score a few goals against us in the second half. And we've lost the second half by a score of 5-4, I would say. But we're going into overtime now with the vaccine, and the result is certain that we will win this, but it's not won yet, and we have to keep going for the moment. So keep going, hold firm, and take the vaccine when it's offered to you.
That concludes our discussion today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I have. My thanks to our panelists, Dr. Fidelma Fitzpatrick and Professor Jonathan Hourihan. We will include links to all of the sites and resources mentioned by our speakers today on the RCSI website. The next event in the MyHealth series will focus on fertility and pregnancy health, which will air on Tuesday, the 27th of April. You can find out more information about this and other events in the MyHealth series on the RCSI website. Thank you from all of us here in RCSI, and stay safe.